Emperor Charles V was in pain. Fate had put him in control of more land, people, and power than any European monarch had enjoyed since the days of the last Roman emperors. 40 years of this responsibility had left him broken and drained, and he was ready to retire. With great difficulty, he took the stage in front of 1,000 members of the Burgundian nobility and began to speak. He told the story of his life and reign, recalling the journeys he made, the wars he fought, and the changes he had tried to enact. His voice shaking, and with tears in his eyes, he ended his speech with a simple request, that all his failures as a ruler be forgiven. Taken aback by the honesty and humility, the entire assembly cried with him. To know if those tears were justified, we need to know the story he told, the story of his life. That year, Charles's great-grandfather and namesake, Charles the Bold, died. He ruled over a rich and powerful realm called Burgundy, but his death created a power vacuum that France was eager to exploit. His sole heir, Mary, came under intense pressure to find a husband that could stop the French advance. She found him in Austria. Maximilian of the Habsburg dynasty was only 18 years old when the two married, but he was already an extremely capable military leader. It also helped that his dad was Archduke of Austria and the Holy Roman Emperor. Together it was enough to protect their dominions in the Low Countries, but the Duchy of Burgundy itself was lost. Maximilian and Mary did not have much time together. After just 5 years of marriage, Mary fell off her horse and didn't get back up. Let's shift our attention to the other side of the equation. Isabella and Ferdinand were heirs to the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon respectively. There was a lot of intrigue and unrest going on in the two realms, and it ultimately resulted in a secret marriage between the two heirs. Isabella defied her brother and King Henry to sneak off and get married to Ferdinand. They married in Valladolid in 1469. The foundation for Spain had just been laid. Then, in 1494, the Italian Wars break out. France wanted to expand its influence in Italy. That angered both Maximilian and the Spanish couple, as they already had a lot of influence in Italy, so logically, an expansion of France could only come at their expense. They negotiated an alliance and sealed it by marrying their children, among them Joanna and Philip, Charles's parents. Charles's birth was celebrated, but his childhood was not destined to have much joy in it. A key theme of his entire reign was the idea of luck. It was thought that a truly great ruler would have luck on his side because he would enjoy God's favor. His luck gave him half of Europe, but it also took away his parents. At the time of his birth, it was not at all obvious that Charles would one day inherit the Spanish crowns, but the deaths of multiple family members meant that his mother Joanna became the heir apparent soon after his death. His parents had to spend most of his early years in Spain, especially once Grandma Isabella died and they ascended to the throne of Castile. The sudden death of his father Philip in September 1506 left his mother trapped, her life controlled by her father Ferdinand. Charles was now lord over the Burgundian lands, and he desperately needed a new set of parents. His grandpa Maximilian was happy to step in. As the Holy Roman Emperor, he was already one of the preeminent monarchs in Europe. Day-to-day responsibility for Burgundy and for Charles was entrusted to Maximilian's other child, Margaret. Together, they became Charles's new parents. What about Charles himself? How was he taking it? The death of Philip hit him hard. He cried a lot. Since he was all of 6, that hardly seems shocking. At the time, he lived in the Kaisershof in Mechelen with 3 siblings, Eleanor, Isabella, and Mary. His brother Ferdinand and his sister Catherine remained in Spain. Charles would not meet them until he was almost 18 years old. His aunt Margaret soon moved in just across the street from them. Growing up with Margaret around must have been fun. Her court was a bustling cultural center. On any given day, about 150 different local notables and grandees would come for lunch. Many famous clergymen and humanists were amongst Charles's tutors, most notably Erasmus. He tried to impress on Charles the futility of spending money on war, but it seems not to have stuck. He preferred the ways of his grandfather.
Maximilian affected the development of young Charles more than anyone, so there are countless similarities between the two. Throughout his life, Charles would pursue Maximilian's goal of building a world Christian empire. For him, it meant expanding his realms, crushing France, and crusading against the Ottomans. Spoiler, Charles would largely stick to this playbook throughout his life. He copied countless behaviors. He trained to be a soldier king, he learned all the different languages of his realms, and he even wrote passive-aggressive letters to rulers and family members when he didn't get what he wanted, just like his grandpa did. He was just as ambitious as his grandpa, which resulted in lots of wars and lots of debt. But that was later in life. Charles still had to go through puberty. It started with a bang, literally. At the age of 12, Charles killed for the first time. He was practicing with his crossbow when he accidentally killed a local villager. That same year, he danced so much he fell ill for almost 2 weeks. He also moved to bustling Brussels, leaving Margaret's Mechelen and her influence behind. Many of the Burgundian nobility wanted Charles to be declared of age, so they began obstructing her agenda. They felt that Charles's emancipation would allow them to sideline Maximilian's foreign influence in favor of a young local ruler whom they could control. Leading the charge was William de Croy. He was destined to become Charles's first major advisor. The Burgundians paid Maximilian off for his consent, and Charles was declared of age on the 5th of January, 1515. His reign had just begun.
The next 6 years of his life were going to be some of the most perilous and dramatic ones. Charles, now a ruler in his own right, needed to secure his succession. Although he may have technically been next in line to all of these lands, experience tells us that unpopular monarchs could easily be swept aside by rival claimants. There were many threats. The Italian wars continued, as did the general animosity with France. The Ottoman Empire was preparing a major advance into Europe. Even his own grandfather Ferdinand was scheming against him, though without success. It was a mess.
Sounds like a lot to deal with for a teenager. So how did he manage it? He didn't. His advisors did. For the first few years of his reign, Charles mostly kept his mouth shut and directed all matters to de Croy. During this time, many people saw him as the real power behind the throne, and they were right. At times, this was a good thing, as he was able to successfully negotiate a treaty with France to keep the peace while Charles was still assembling all of his realms. But his actions also harmed Charles's standing. He was aggressively corrupt and nepotist. De Croy took over Charles's political education from Maximilian. He instilled in him a rock-hard work ethic, advising him to read all incoming reports himself, even if it meant working late into the night. That way, he would be prepared if one of his advisors tried to lie or misrepresent something. His lessons were useful, and they helped Charles a lot later in life.
Let us return to the timeline of his successions. On the 23rd of January 1516, Ferdinand dies. You might think that the next words out of my mouth would be something like, "So Charles inherits both Castile and Aragon." But that is not true. His mother is still alive. She is next in line. Of course, it was common for men to rule on behalf of the true queen. In this case, he would have it even easier than usual because Joanna was known to be insane. But was she really?
Out of everything Charles does in his life, in his personal life in particular, his treatment of his mother seems almost uniquely evil. This mistreatment had started under his father, who cheated and provoked Joanna. She was locked up and marginalized. Her father Ferdinand continued her imprisonment after Philip died. In the closing years of his reign, he became less and less popular, and Joanna would have been a major threat to his power. He confined her at the monastery in Tordesillas, forbidding most people from speaking to her, having her whipped and abused in other ways. Charles enhanced this captivity further, and he created a fantasy world in which Ferdinand still lived, and the people taking care of her used Ferdinand as a bogeyman to scare her into cooperating. There is vanishingly little evidence for the fact that Joanna was seriously mentally ill. She might have been depressed, at worst. Ambassadors and envoys who happened to interact with her commented on the fact that she did not seem mad at all, and that something fishy seemed to be going on. In fact, it is her confinement that seemed to have been designed to induce these unhealthy behaviors. Charles had no reason to treat his mother like this. Not only was she not a threat, she actively resisted calls to remarry. She wanted to preserve her inheritance intact for Charles, and the way that he failed to repay her loyalty was kind of vile.
Charles met his mother for the first time in 12 years when he went to Spain to claim his inheritance. Despite everything, Joanna agreed to step aside and let Charles rule in her name. Legally, she would remain the sole monarch until her death in 1555. He met his brother Ferdinand and his sister Catherine for the first time shortly after. But there was trouble on the horizon. Charles's Burgundian cronies began siphoning wealth and elevating themselves to positions of authority. The Spanish nobility and people were getting madder by the minute, eventually exploding into a state of open revolt. But before the situation could come to a head, news arrived from Germany. Dearest Grandpa Maximilian was dead. Maximilian passed away on the 12th of January 1519. He had been thinking about death for a while. He started traveling everywhere with his coffin beginning in 1514. But he also had other thoughts about death, such as the succession of Charles in the Holy Roman Empire. Although it was an elected monarchy, it had a particular quirk. Let me explain. The way the empire worked was that you had 7 electors. After the death of the previous monarch, a candidate had to secure the support of at least 4 of these electors to be called King of the Romans. Once this person was crowned by the Pope, they could call themselves Holy Roman Emperor. A current emperor could thus convince the electors to elect his successor to the position of King of the Romans while he was still alive. The papal coronation had little impact on the emperor's actual powers. It was most useful for enabling this very loophole. Maximilian was never crowned by the Pope, so he could never firmly secure the position for Charles. Everything was complicated by the fact that France decided to get involved. Francis I became King of France in 1515. Soon after that, the electors of the HRE decided to get spicy. Some of them felt like they could stand to profit if they made the election seem competitive. They made the Habsburgs and the French compete for their votes, though most of the electors would never want a French king to rule over them. Both sides spent massive amounts of money on bribes. In total, Charles spent up to 1.5 million gold florins on his election, which in 2025 prices was still a lot, but it was worth it. On the 28th of June 1519, he was elected King of the Romans. He got all 7 votes.
The whole exercise was beneficial for another reason. For Charles and his team, this was a great learning experience. His court had grown larger, more diverse, more international over the past few years. They had learned to move money around, collecting it from Charles's different realms and sending it to Italian and German bankers who had funded Charles's election and would be instrumental in funding his future wars. They had dialed in the whole decision-making structure underlying his reign. Throughout the rest of his life, Charles would be constantly surrounded by a council of advisors who helped him with questions that concerned all of his realms. All local decisions about individual territories would be devolved to trustworthy regents, as it became clear that Charles would have to be constantly moving around. For most of his life, he was represented by his aunt Margaret, later his sister Marie, in Burgundy, by his brother Ferdinand in the HRE, and by his wife, later his son, in the Spanish realms. His electoral campaign had also woken Charles up to the realities of governance. He had grown up obsessively reading tales of chivalry, of the lives of his ancestors and the court of Burgundy in centuries past. He had romanticized what his life was going to be. He had half expected the emperorship to be handed to him on a silver platter. He now began to realize that his reign was not going to be some sort of divine fairy tale, which is a good thing, as war loomed on the horizon.
France and the Habsburgs were destined for conflict. Let's look at the situation on the eve of war in 1521. The lands that Charles V inherited encircled France, which set off alarm bells in Paris. On the flip side, France was a major obstacle to Charles's plans. It prevented overland travel between Spain and the rest of Europe, and it was also the only real counterweight to Charles. While Charles ruled over large parts of Europe, his advantage was not overwhelming. For example, France had a respectable 19 million inhabitants, compared to about 28 million for the Habsburg lands in total. France had less resources, but it was a much more centralized state. There were different factors that spoke for or against either power coming out on top. A key swing constituency was England, which kept switching sides, but in 1521 could be considered an ally of the Habsburgs. Most critically, the two sides were already engaged in a fierce battle for dominance in Italy. France had occupied or controlled the realms of Savoy, Genoa, and Milan. If France could keep these Italian allies and maybe make a few more, it would win economic dominance over the Habsburgs. Italy was very rich after all. On the flip side, controlling Milan and Genoa would keep France out of the rest of Italy and improve communications between Spain and Germany. France's king, Francis I, decided to strike first. He ordered covert attacks in border regions to provoke Charles, but then the whole enterprise started to fall apart. Habsburg armies made solid progress in Italy and on the French Burgundian frontier. To press his advantage further, Charles traveled to London, where he met Henry VIII. After a lot of drinking, partying, and negotiation, the two sides agreed to the very unsubtly named Great Enterprise. They intend to invade France from two sides and partition it. Henry invaded in the fall of 1523 and made it to Montdidier, only 80 kilometers away from Paris. Charles, however, completely failed to live up to his end of the bargain. He was unable to convince the representatives in the Cortes of Castile to spend money on this endeavor. They told him to recapture some occupied lands on the French frontier, but to go no further. Luckily, Charles was not the only one who could fumble things. In early 1525, Francis and his army were sieging down Pavia in northern Italy. Perhaps overly optimistic, Francis allowed his army to split in two. Francis had spread his forces dangerously thin. With the help of misleading rumors, Francis was made to believe that the Habsburg forces were retreating. In fact, the defenders of Pavia had infiltrated the French siege works. On the 24th of February, Francis ordered an all-out attack, and then all hell broke loose. The battle was short but catastrophic, for Francis was now a prisoner.
Charles could not wish for a better birthday present. One of the primary reasons for pursuing this war was the issue of reputation. If Charles won his first war, he would be known as a victorious king who should be feared and respected. Had he lost, the damage to his reputation would have been immense. According to this logic, capturing your adversary was more or less the best thing that could happen to you. Charles himself attributed this victory to divine intervention. He was very religious, which made him seem more humble than he actually was. He even forbade public celebrations, stating that a victory of Christians over Christians should be nothing to celebrate. Privately, he was overjoyed. He was a vindictive man and loved settling scores. Negotiations with Francis soon began. He was brought to Spain, where he soon found ways to play Charles. Charles's weakness was Burgundy. He really wanted his ancestral homeland returned, even though it was not a strategic priority. Francis wore him down further and further until Charles agreed to let Francis go before he implemented most of the provisions of the treaty that they had agreed. Many of his advisors could see what was going on, but Charles remained blind.
The very same day that Francis crossed the border into France, on the 17th of March, 1526, he started reneging on his promises. In the middle of the year, Charles faced opposition from the Holy League of Cognac, which aimed to rid Italy of Habsburg influence. He suffered minor setbacks, but in 1527 his forces successfully took Rome. The trouble was that the soldiers had not been paid, and their commander died right as they moved into Rome. The Pope was held hostage as Charles's troops violently looted the town. It was a dark stain on his legacy. In public, he pretended to be apologetic, but in private, he was overjoyed because he had successfully taken revenge on a problematic pope. In 1528, Charles had another stroke of good fortune. An admiral that had been leading the naval blockade of Naples on behalf of the French defected to the Habsburg side. Not only does he defect, he takes his ships with him and returns to his native Genoa, where he re-establishes a pro-Habsburg government. With one move, the French position in Italy is imperiled, and it's time for another round of negotiations. Charles's Aunt Margaret and Francis's mother Louise successfully conclude what is called the Ladies' Peace. After 8 long years, Charles's first war with France ends on the 5th of August, 1529.
I'm not going to bother with the terms of the peace. As you might have noticed, I said first war with France. These terms would not remain in place for long. Let's talk about his wife instead. Charles had got married in 1526. His wife was Isabella, a princess from Portugal. It was by no means his first betrothal. He had been promised to various English and French princesses, but it never really worked out. What spoke for Isabella was primarily her large dowry, which could be used to fund more war. Yea, war. Charles and Isabella started off strong. They would not leave their bed until 10 or 11 o'clock each day. Charles seemed a lot more content. People around him complained that he seemed more leisurely and did not attend to business as fast as he used to. But he soon fell into an unfortunate pattern. Charles really must have believed that he was God's sword on earth. Everything in his life was meant to be subordinate to him, and that included his wife. As soon as Isabella would get pregnant, Charles would feel free to leave and fight another war in Europe, leaving her in charge of Spain. She became more and more depressed, especially since only 3 of her 7 children survived to adulthood. She was a capable regent, and while she was alive, she successfully kept her husband from pillaging the Spanish treasuries whenever he needed money for his wars, which ensured a degree of prosperity. Unfortunately, it seems that she fell ill with tuberculosis and passed away on the 1st of May, 1539. Charles was not by her side. Her death hits him hard. He locks himself away for 2 months, and he never really gets over it. He wears dark clothing for the rest of his life. It's easy to say that he should have appreciated her more while she was alive, and that is definitely true. But her death and his regret are part of a larger trend I see in his life. To me, it seems like he starts his life hyped up on these tales of Burgundian chivalry. His inheritance is almost unprecedented, and many of the most senior advisors and political commentators of the time genuinely believed that he might change something about this world, as does he. But the longer he rules, the more he has to pay. His relationships, his health, his happiness all suffer more and more as he is confronted with the task of actually ruling all of these lands. He has some victories, but he spends most of his life rushing to deal with the next crisis. So by the end of it, he is drowning in regret.
One of these crises was unfolding in Germany. In 1517, while Charles was in Spain claiming his throne, Martin Luther published his famous 95 Theses. People did not really know what to make of this. A lot of Catholics shared Luther's concerns about the high degree of corruption in the church, including Charles. His agents even offered Luther a deal. They would support his efforts to fight corruption as long as he did it from behind the scenes. Luther rejects this, and the stage is set for confrontation. Luther is summoned to the Diet in the city of Worms in 1521. The Diet is basically the parliament of the Holy Roman Empire, like the Cortes in Spain. Charles intended to deal with a whole slew of issues, but they would pale in comparison to what happened on the 18th of April when Martin Luther took the stage. He went on and on about the heretical texts he was accused of writing, monologuing like a true professional. At one point, Charles tells him to cut it out and just say whether or not he retracts his heretical statements. Luther says, "No, I reject the authority of the Pope and the Church. I know what the Bible says, and those words form the basis of my belief." To quote him, "I neither can nor will retract anything, for it cannot be either safe or honest for a Christian to speak against his conscience. Here I stand. I cannot do otherwise. God help me. Amen." Charles was incredibly mad. He had just been openly defied in front of all the German leaders, and he simply did not understand how one man could think that he had gotten right, what 1,000 years of Catholic clergymen had apparently gotten wrong. The whole thing was a disaster for Charles. Charles banned Lutheran thought, but only for a few years. Out of everything Charles did, his failure to contain Lutheranism hurt his dynastic prospects the most. Let's return to the narrative to see why he failed. Charles had made peace with France in 1529 and proceeded to Italy. In Bologna, on his birthday, the 24th of February 1530, he became the last person ever to be crowned Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope. He then proceeded to Germany, where he invited both Lutherans and Catholics to come to another diet, this time at Augsburg, to try and solve their issues. This was a great opportunity to peacefully resolve the religious divide. But the death of a key counselor, Mercurio Gattinara, right before the diet began, caught Charles unprepared. He was an incredibly talented lawyer from Italy who had replaced De Croix as Charles's main advisor. He was also the architect behind most of the administrative machinery underpinning Charles's reign. Without him and his negotiating skills, Charles was unable to reach the necessary compromise. At least he was able to convince the electors to make his brother Ferdinand king of the Romans. He was crowned on the 5th of January, 1531. That might be a bit surprising. After all, Charles's son and heir, Philip, had been born in 1527. Why didn't Charles just name him the successor? See, it had been clear to many people for years that Charles had bitten off more than he could chew. All the way back during his initial campaign to be elected king of the Romans, multiple close advisors had floated the idea of perhaps making Ferdinand king instead. Charles would not have it, but he grew up and realized that a partition of his territories was inevitable after all. Thank you. Charles had actually signed over control over the ancestral Habsburg lands in Austria to Ferdinand back in 1521, and his coronation as king of the Romans was a further step towards the division of his lands, a division that would prove to be permanent. Ferdinand needed all the resources he could get his hands on because he was fighting his own battle. The eternal grandpa Maximilian had arranged Ferdinand's marriage to Anne of Bohemia and Hungary. That came in handy in 1526 when Anne's brother, the king of Bohemia and Hungary, died after falling off his horse. You'd be surprised by how many people died in horse-related incidents at this time. Ferdinand successfully pressed his claim to the two lands. Habsburg dominion in those lands would last until the end of World War I thanks to his efforts. Anne's brother had perished in the face of a massive Ottoman advance into Europe. By 1529, the Ottomans laid siege to Vienna for the first time, but were repulsed.
News of a massive Ottoman offensive reached Charles's ears in 1532, which spurred him into action. He made a fateful choice. He granted the Lutherans temporary tolerance in return for military support against the Ottomans. This tolerance would be extended time and again all the way until 1546, because Charles kept on fighting wars and needed every soldier he could get. This was a major reason for the relatively unrestrained growth of Lutheranism during this time. But in 1532, it allowed Charles to create a truly massive army. Unfortunately for him, he never got to put it to the test. The Ottomans refused to engage in battle with this numerically superior host and just retreated back home. In the future, the Habsburgs would favor a defensive posture. They would build up their forts and bait the Ottomans into exhausting themselves by forcing them into sieges. But for now, Charles returned to Spain to figure out how to strike back.
The newest front of the crusade was destined to be North Africa. I say crusade because that is exactly what Charles saw it as. Fighting the enemies of Christendom was his greatest ambition, perhaps another consequence of reading those Burgundian stories in his formative years. In 1535, he sets his sights on Tunis. See, much of the northern Mediterranean coastline was subjected to raids by Ottoman-aligned pirates, such as the fearsome Captain Barbarossa. No, not that one, this one. But seriously, these pirate raids were violent and disruptive, and if a ruler could stop them, they would earn much favor with the people. Charles devised a complex scheme by which two fleets would sail from Spain and Italy, meet at Sardinia, and then sail onto Tunis. 400 ships carried over 50,000 people across the Mediterranean, and they successfully took Tunis late in July. Having installed a friendly government, Charles returned to Europe to switch on the propaganda machine. He journeyed through southern Italy to celebrate his victory. He needed to talk himself up, as his achievements in Africa, while full of hype moments and aura, lacked substance. Barbarossa remained at large, moving to a new base of operations and continuing his devastating raids. In fact, he was about to become an even more serious problem for Charles. In 1536, France had entered into a formal alliance with the Ottomans. Francis had hoped that his alliance with the Ottomans would be able to overwhelm the Habsburg realms, but he was mistaken. Both sides knew that war was coming, so they made the necessary preparations. Responding to French provocations, in early 1536, Charles denounced Francis and attempted to cross the Alps to take Marseille. It was a disaster. He ran out of food and had to withdraw, losing many capable troops and commanders in the process. Charles fell into a deep depression, but the French failed to capitalize on their advantage, even though they had Ottoman support, so by 1538, Charles and Francis had agreed to a ceasefire. Later that year, at Aigues-Mortes, they met face-to-face and attempted to reach a more permanent settlement. The mood was light, there was lots of joking and banter. There seemed to be a deal in the making. The two monarchs might have left the meeting with every intention of carrying out this deal, but it would quickly come to naught.
The rationale for attempting to pursue a sustainable peace was clear. War had drained the resources of both the French and the Habsburgs. People were tired and poor. Charles began running into major funding problems with the various cortes, diets, estates generals of his realms. In 1538, instead of approving taxes, the Cortes of Castile told Charles that maybe he should just spend some time worrying about Spain and not think about war for a while. As per usual, he was wholly unable to stomach this open defiance. There was also widespread opposition forming in Burgundy. His hometown of Ghent had refused to pay any more tax in 1539. Charles made use of the peace and traveled through France. He and Francis staged a triumphant entry into Paris, where Charles was welcomed by over 200,000 spectators. People were very happy that there was no more war. He then proceeded to Ghent, where he violently imposed his taxation regime, executing traitors and replacing the municipal government. This episode highlights a key problem with Charles's realms. He inherited all of the enemies and problems of his territories, but his attention was divided and he could not deal with those problems as effectively. His nominally huge power and wealth further polarized people against him, resulting in constructs like the French-Ottoman alliance, that in turn resulted in even more war. It drove up the taxes of his subjects and saddled his successors with debt. It feels like the whole was weaker than the sum of its parts, which is why his lands were divided after his death. Also, most of the time, these increases in taxation were not violently rammed through, but negotiated in return for greater regional autonomy. So Charles effectively spent most of his reign making it even more difficult to keep his lands together in the long term.
His next big idea was to go to North Africa again. This time he aimed for Algiers, but the enterprise was a disaster. Due to various delays, he got to Algiers so late in 1541 that his fleet was hit by a massive storm. Many ships sank and his army starved. Charles had to eat horse meat in front of his soldiers to convince them to also do it. He returned home half dead and embarrassed. But there would be no rest for the wicked. Charles's lieutenant in Milan executed 2 French ambassadors. They had been trying to sneak through the Habsburg lands on the way to the Ottoman Empire. Charles did not order their deaths, but he did cover them up, which gave France the perfect excuse to resume hostilities. This time it really seemed like Charles was going to get his ass beat. Francis had left no stone unturned. His plans included a combined attack on Burgundy with Guelders in Denmark. He wanted to invade Spain and enlisted the help of the Ottomans to mount a simultaneous offensive into Hungary. Any enemy of Charles was made into an ally of Francis. Wanting to press his advantage, in mid-1542 he kicked off hostilities with the combined attack on Burgundy. It was effective at first, but then one of the French armies just randomly retreated because the commander had heard a rumor that there was going to be a battle with Charles, and wanted to be part of it to share the glory. Nice work, bro. Attacks into Spain also failed. Only the Ottoman invasion was moderately successful, but fighting the Ottomans had become relatively routine for Ferdinand, and they were not even able to reach Vienna, let alone siege it. Charles decided to strike back. He spent most of 1543 putting out little fires by doing things such as conquering Guelders. He had big plans for the coming year. He had reached out to Henry, and they had agreed on a Great Enterprise 2.0, another combined invasion of France. The campaign of 1544 started off well. Henry came down from Calais, and Charles advanced from the east. He came pretty close to Paris, but then swung round and headed north to join forces with Henry. That was enough to freak Francis out, and he gave Charles basically everything he wanted. On the 18th of September, 1544, the war ended. It was the last time Charles would have to face Francis, as he died 3 years later. Charles had restored his reputation after the Algiers debacle, and won his greatest victory yet. All these wars leave one with a burning question. How exactly was Charles able to resist his enemies so effectively? He was a capable military leader, and luck was sometimes on his side, but the secret to his success lay all the way across the Atlantic. Charles was the first monarch to control significant lands in America. the very beginning of his reign, in 1519, Hernan Cortes initiated the conquest of Mexico and the Aztec Empire. About a decade later, Francisco Pizarro would do the same thing with the Inca Empire. The transfer of massive amounts of gold, silver, and other treasures from America to Europe played an absolutely vital role in financing Charles's reign. Throughout his life, he enjoyed the fortune of having treasure fleets arrive at the exact moment when he stood on the brink of disaster. Obviously, these conquests came at a massive human cost.
Charles wished for the conquest of America to be as peaceful as possible. He saw spreading Christianity as an inalienable part of his mission as emperor. To that end, the native inhabitants were to be treated like regular Spanish subjects after their conversion. But what resources did he have to see his wishes be fulfilled? Viceroys like Cortes and Pizarro constantly lied to him about the situation on the ground, and there was desperately little information to counter their lies. There were also no resources available for sending a fleet across the Atlantic to force compliance with the law. Ultimately, the massive amounts of treasure coming from these lands meant that Charles was prepared to look the other way while the conquistadors established the encomienda system, basically a form of slavery. The conquistadors expected to be rewarded. They were the armed men that ensured Spanish dominion over all these lands, and if they did not receive their dues, they had the means to revolt and sever ties, as Charles would painfully find out in 1542. The failure at Algiers made Charles think that God was punishing him for not doing enough to protect his native subjects. He promulgated new laws that aimed to put an end to the abuse and slavery. However, his representatives in Peru were overzealous in implementing them and provoked a massive conquistador revolt. Charles was able to re-establish control, but at the cost of actually expanding the encomienda system. After that point, he was rather content with just letting the cash roll in while more and more natives perished in the American mines. The many crises that Charles had to deal with severely affected his health. His main problem was the gout, which caused him to live in a near constant state of pain after 1543. His jaw was not properly aligned with his mouth, so he could never chew food properly, which was one of the main causes of his gout, besides his meat-heavy diet. He increasingly struggled to walk or ride horses, meaning he could no longer participate in his favorite hobby, hunting. Instead, he switched to doing math, reading books, and learning languages, as well as getting really into clocks. He built up a massive collection of them. He had to spend increasing amounts of time either laying in bed or chilling in a sauna, which brought him at least some measure of relief. He had some fight left in him, but that was draining fast. In 1546, he decided that it was time to finally go against the Lutherans. 5 years prior, there had been another attempt to solve the religious issue peacefully, and once again the two sides got tantalizingly close. There remained only a few technical details on doctrine to hammer out, but the resumption of hostilities with France and the Ottomans meant that Charles once again made the fateful choice to grant temporary tolerance in return for military support. He did not know it then, but he had let the final possibility for peace slip away.
In 1546, the Lutherans knew what was coming. Charles had suspended their tolerance and moved to crush what was called the Schmalkaldic League, a defensive alliance of Lutheran states. Both sides raised an army and engaged one another at Ingolstadt. Schmalkaldic forces had the advantage, but they failed to capitalize on it because they were divided and could not agree on what to do. Their army was controlled by a committee, as the Schmalkaldic League consisted of many tiny states that did not really trust one another. From that point on, their unity shattered, and Charles could simply pick off the Lutheran states one by one until he arrived in Saxony. There, early on the 24th of April, 1547, he ambushed the remainder of the Lutheran army. He described the engagement at Mühlberg as a hunt rather than a battle. After 22 hours of slaughter, Lutheran resistance ceased.
Charles attempted to use the opportunity to force a religious settlement. He oversaw the creation of a document called the Interim, which was meant to temporarily regulate religious practices within Germany. Catholics rejected it because they thought only the Pope or a church council could make those kinds of decisions, and only some of the Lutherans abided by it. Charles lacked the strength to enforce it uniformly. This does not seem like a sustainable recipe for peace, and indeed it wasn't. War would soon return to Germany, and Charles would play a central role in bringing it about.
By this point in his life, he began thinking about passing the reins on to his son, Philip. For all intents and purposes, his reign began in 1543 when Charles left Spain, leaving him in charge as regent. Charles had tried to give as much attention as he could to the education of his son. He wrote essays for him, sharing with him all the tricks of the trade that he had learned. For most of his life, Charles seemed prepared to divide his inheritance, as it was clearly too much for one man. But for some reason known only to God, Charles decided to disregard their original plan. He had decided to try and secure the imperial throne for Philip. This was a major betrayal for his brother Ferdinand. He had loyally served him for 30 years with the expectation that his line of the family would continue to hold the imperial throne. It made all the sense in the world, but Charles would not have it. An open break between the two brothers was only avoided through the intervention of their sister Mary. They worked out a deal where they would try to alternate the succession, although it would never actually be implemented, leading to the permanent division of the Habsburg dynasty.
While this deal paused the dispute in the Habsburg family, the same cannot be said for the Holy Roman Empire at large. The electors were outraged at this family agreement. After all, this was a clear encroachment on their prerogative to elect the emperor. This, combined with the fact that Charles treated both his enemies and allies within the empire pretty poorly in the years since Mühlberg, brought the situation to a breaking point. As 1552 rolled around, Charles remained oblivious to the developments occurring all around him. His circle of advisors had gotten smaller and smaller as the people who had been around him all his life slowly passed away, until all of his affairs once again passed through the hands of just one man, Antoine Perrenot de Granvelle. Charles himself was old, sick, and tired.
He remained oblivious to the danger until a Lutheran army, financed by France, almost captured him. He had to flee Innsbruck in the middle of the night and found refuge in the relatively remote town of Villach. Once again, his American money saved him, and he was able to raise a new army and make peace with the Protestants. He remained at war with France. It was time for the emperor to mount his last campaign. He attempted to reconquer Metz, a town that had defected to France. Although his army was huge, the modern defenses of Metz refused to budge. After wasting 25,000 lives, Charles had had enough, packed up his army, and went home to Brussels.
He had spent most of the siege sick and in bed, complaining about everyone who had ever betrayed him, a situation that continued for most of 1553. He was in so much pain that he could not move for a while, but he had one last scheme in him. He arranged the marriage of his son Philip to Mary Tudor, who had taken charge of England in July 1553, thus opening the door to a Habsburg Britain. He told Philip to come marry her and then go to Brussels to take over. He had had enough. After this point, he retired to a cottage and cared for little more than his clocks. He only briefly came out of retirement to defend Burgundy against a half-hearted French invasion in 1554, but then that really was it. In September 1555, Philip came to Brussels. The reunion was emotional, and Charles spent much time with his son, discussing various affairs and strategies. If you still remember the beginning of the video, you'll know that on the 25th of October, 1555, Charles gave his farewell speech and transferred power over Burgundy to his son. Other abdications would follow into 1556. By this point, Charles's only priority was wrapping up his affairs so that he could proceed to Spain. By July, that time had come. Together with his sisters Marie and Eleanor, Charles left Brussels for the last time. On the way out of town, he kept turning around, looking back at the city that he had spent his youth in. Tears streamed down his face. You can only wonder if he knew that he would never again see the land of his birth. He exchanged some final goodbyes with Philip, boarded his ship at the port of Vlissingen, and set sail for Spain. Charles V's reign was well and truly over. His retirement in Spain was peaceful but not very long. He made it to the monastery at Yuste in February of 1557, where he had his own apartments. He took his clocks and his paintings with him, as well as a special, German-made sauna for his gout. To pass the time, he invited scholars to debate in front of him while he ate his lunch, and then had a friar read to him until he got sleepy. He also worked on his memoirs and tried to help historians document his life accurately. While his health improved a little after his resignations, by early 1558, he was getting weaker with each passing day. On the 31st of August, Charles had a premonition of his coming demise. He spent some time looking at paintings, including at one depicting his wife, before falling violently ill the next day. He died at 2 a.m. on the 21st of September, clutching the same crucifix that his wife had held when she died almost 20 years earlier.
His death precipitated an outpouring of grief. His family members presided over memorials held in all his different realms. As many as 2,000 churches held funeral processions in his honor. Was this grief deserved? Was Charles a good monarch or not? His record differs depending on which country we view his reign from. In the HRE, he was a failure. Protestantism would tear all of Germany apart and permanently cripple the institutions of the Holy Roman Empire. In 1555, he and Ferdinand were forced to accept the Peace of Augsburg, making the religious divide permanent. He failed because he did not spend enough time there, and he did not have enough German advisors or allies, causing him to underestimate the amount of support Protestantism had until it was way too late. Protestantism would also tear the Low Countries apart during the reign of his son. But during his life, he successfully defended the Burgundian realm from being absorbed by France. In fact, this was one of the few areas where Charles had actually conquered lands, leaving Burgundy far larger and more powerful than it ever was. In Italy, he was also able to stop the French expansion. In fact, the Italian wars came to a permanent end shortly after his death with the Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis, signed in 1559. But peace had come at a cost. These Italian wars had single-handedly ruined what had been the richest part of Europe, ending the Renaissance. His record in the Spanish kingdoms was also pretty terrible. He ended up being a much-liked king for all the victories he scored over France, his action against the feared North African pirates, and the conquest of America. But not only did he fail to use the colonial wealth to actually develop Spain, he ran up a massive debt that would cause his son many difficulties and would permanently damage Spain's financial fortunes.
That's the thing about Charles. He inherited these massive lands, and while they gave him insane amounts of power, it also gave him all the problems and enemies of these lands. His attention was divided between so many territories that he could never deal with problems as quickly and effectively as he would have had he only ruled one land. It is no wonder that he chose to divide his realms. At this point in history, it seemed that one monarch for one kingdom was clearly the winning formula. Charles failed to achieve many of his own aims. Christendom seemed less united than ever. He also had many faults, as most people do, being incredibly arrogant and vindictive. Many of his achievements would be better described as the achievements of his family and advisors. He was a regular man in a position of enormous power. One cannot ignore his virtues. He took his job seriously, trying to do what he thought was decent. He worked into the night, day after day, trying to stay on top of the massive volume of reports coming into his office. He learned at least half a dozen languages and attempted to keep all of his realms happy, an impossible task, for some choices could only be made at the expense of others. He agonized for days or even weeks on end about important decisions, writing rationales for or against different courses of action. Through these significant efforts, he was able to avoid an outright separation of his realms while he was still alive, and he did successfully secure Habsburg dominance of Europe for centuries. If he had been the ruler of a single small state, he probably would have done a lot more good for his people. But destiny gave him a different role, and he spent his whole life trying, often failing, to live up to it. I hope you have enjoyed this extensive biography of Charles V. There is always more to learn, so check out the sources that I used. You can find them in the description. Please subscribe, like, and comment your thoughts. This has been Ivan with Retrospect History, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye.